Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the OBR's press briefing on our 2024 Fiscal Risks and Sustainability Report. We had to delay the publication of this report due to the election, meaning we've not been able to invite you to join us in person today, but it's great that so many of you have joined online. I'm Laura Gardner, Deputy Chief of Staff, and I'll be chairing today's event. I'll be joined by the three members of the Budget Responsibility Committee, the Chair, Richard Hughes, along with Professor David Miles and Tom Josephs. In a moment, Richard will run us through a summary of the report that we've just published, after which the committee will take your questions. You can submit these at any time via Slido, which you can access via the QR code shown here, the link on our website, or our Twitter feed. Before Richard gets going, I'd like to start by thanking, on behalf of the committee, staff from the OBR for all their hard work in putting this latest report together, and also officials across government for their input too. Of course, all of the analysis and conclusions continue to represent the BRC's own independent judgments. With that, let's hear from Richard.
Thanks, Laura, and good morning, everyone. This year's report looks at three long-term risks to fiscal sustainability. Chapter 2 considers the potential damage to our economy and public finances from a changing climate. Chapter 3 looks at the impact of the health of the population on fiscal sustainability. And Chapter 4 provides an updated set of long-term projections for the evolution of the public finances over the next 50 years. These projections take as their starting point the 5-year forecasts we published in our March Economic and Fiscal Outlook. As such, they reflect our understanding of the state of the economy and the cost of government policy as they stood in March of this year. We'll be providing an updated 5-year forecast, taking account of the effect of the new government's policies in our next DFO, which will be published alongside the Chancellor's autumn budget on the 30th of October. Let me now turn to the first chapter of the report, looking at the fiscal risks posed by climate change. These risks can be divided into three distinct but related categories. First, there are the costs to government of climate change mitigation. That is, the actions necessary to reduce our future carbon emissions and limit our contribution to the rise in global temperatures. And these were the focus of our 2021 Fiscal Risks Report. Second, there are the economic and fiscal consequences of the physical damage caused by climatic changes that still occur despite those mitigation efforts. These climate-related damage costs are the focus of this year's FRS. And third, there are the economic and fiscal implications of adapting to a hotter and more volatile climate. And we'll be looking at these potentially additional costs in a future FRS. Our analysis takes as its starting point two of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's scenarios for the path of global carbon emissions and associated rise in average temperatures over the remainder of this century. These are a less than 2-degree rise in temperatures, which would be consistent with a successful global effort to reach net zero emissions by 2070, and a less than 3-degree rise in temperatures, which would be consistent with current global commitments on emissions. Rising global temperatures and the extreme weather events associated with them impose both indirect and direct costs on the public finances. Indirect costs arise from the reduction in the productive potential of the economy due to things like rising energy costs, damage to residential and commercial property, and disruption to product, labor, and insurance markets. We estimate that these could reduce the level of GDP in 50 years by around 3% in the below 2-degree scenario and around 5% in the below 3-degree scenario. Lower GDP reduces government revenue and therefore increases government borrowing in 50 years by 0.7% of GDP in the below 2-degree scenario and 1.1% of GDP in the below 3-degree scenario. In addition to these indirect costs, there are also likely to be direct costs from climate change in the form of the additional demands placed on the public finances due to more frequent and severe extreme weather events. These include additional pressures on the NHS and emergency services, the need to repair damage to publicly owned buildings and infrastructure, and pressure to compensate households and businesses for their uninsured damages. In the chapter, we look at the potential direct costs associated with these types of extreme weather events that have historically been the most relevant for the UK. These are more frequent and severe heat waves and coastal river and surface flooding. We estimate that the additional direct fiscal pressures generated by these events could cost the government a further 0.05% of GDP in the below 2-degree scenario and 0.08% of GDP in the below 3-degree scenario by the mid-2070s. Taking these indirect and direct costs together with the cost of financing the additional government borrowing and accounting for the smaller economy they produce, the total cost of climate-related damage over the next 50 years could add around an additional 25% of GDP to government debt in the below 2-degree scenario and an additional 35% of GDP to government debt in the below 3-degree scenario. But the uncertainties around these estimates are very large, and because they only look at domestically generated costs and don't take account of potential spillovers from more severe climatic changes in other parts of the world, the balance of risks is likely skewed toward more adverse outcomes. We therefore look at a range of alternative scenarios based on different assumptions about the scale of economic damage and how government policy responds to it. Varying some of the parameters underpinning these estimates could reduce the overall debt impact to below 10% of GDP, or raise it above 65% of GDP by the mid-2070s. It's tempting to want to conclude that these damage costs can be avoided by more determined action on our part to reduce our own emissions. And that's almost certainly true to some degree, especially if it spurs other countries to more determined action as well. But it's important to bear in mind that more than half of the stock of emissions released into the atmosphere and the rise in global average temperatures assumed in these scenarios has already happened. And the UK today represents less than 1% of global emissions, while the world's largest emitters like the US, China, and India are significantly behind us in getting to net zero. So some increase in climate-related damage to the UK economy and public finances looks inevitable, and already seems to be happening. And it's probably more realistic to think of these estimates of the fiscal cost of climate damage as being additional to the estimated 20% of GDP in fiscal costs associated with the national effort to mitigate climate change by reducing our own emissions to net zero by 2050. Let me now turn to the second topic in this year's FRS, health. The health chapter of the population is an important driver of the UK's economic and fiscal prospects, and has been a major focus of our risk reports in recent years. Our 2021 report looked at the near-term impact of the pandemic on the UK economy and public finances. Our 2023 report looked at the risks posed by the post-pandemic rise in health-related inactivity in our medium-term fiscal forecast. In this report, we look at the long-run impact of health on the population and the sustainability of the public finances. The starting point for this analysis is an updated assessment of recent trends in health and healthcare spending. As you can see from the charts on this slide, the steady improvement in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy in the UK and other G7 countries witnessed through much of the past 2 centuries has slowed and partly reversed in recent years. Underlying this has been a mixed pre-pandemic picture on physical health, with continued improvements in some areas but worsening in others, a steady deterioration in self-reported mental health, and the impact of the pandemic, which has exacerbated existing health challenges and disrupted the delivery of both physical and mental health services. Over the same period, the UK has seen relatively strong growth in spending on health. Real health spending per person has risen 3 times faster than per capita GDP over the past 2 decades. And since the start of the century, total UK health spending as a share of GDP has risen from below 6% to above 11%, taking the UK from the lowest to the 6th highest among 19 advanced economies. So despite devoting an unprecedented share of its national income to healthcare in recent years, the UK has seen the rate of improvement in the overall health of the population stall and possibly shift into reverse. Looking ahead, the report provides an updated central projection for public spending on health over the next 50 years. This projection takes the estimated cost of the NHS workforce plan over the next 4 years, shown in purple, and thereafter it's based on an updated analysis of the main historical drivers of health spending in the UK. As you can see from this chart, the single largest driver of health spending empirically has actually been rising per capita incomes, shown in yellow, which increase demand for healthcare as they do for most other services in the economy. If this were the only pressure on healthcare spending, then it would be much less of a worry from a fiscal sustainability perspective. But the demographic pressures of an aging society, shown in blue, add to demand for healthcare, especially over the next 2 decades as the post-war baby boom generation reach their 80s and 90s. On top of these upward pressures on the demand for healthcare are a set of upward pressures on the unit cost of providing that healthcare, shown in green. These comprise the apparent productivity constraints on the delivery of in-person services like healthcare, the so-called bone wall effect, the growing prevalence of chronic conditions, which raise individuals' lifetime healthcare costs, and other factors, like the rising cost of new medical technologies. Assuming current and future governments continue to respond to these pressures by increasing NHS spending, our baseline projection is for real health spending to continue to grow by just over 3% a year on average over the next 50 years. Under these assumptions, public health spending rises from just under 8% of GDP last year to 14.5% of GDP by the mid-2070s. And as you can see from this chart, this is slightly less than we projected in our 2022 FRS. This largely reflects slightly slower growth in the unit cost of healthcare in the early part of the projection, and a slightly lower old age dependency ratio due to higher net migration in the latest ONS population projection. But this is only one possible scenario for the future path of health spending. And changes in population health have wider fiscal effects beyond just their direct impact on health spending. Healthier people are more likely to be employed, often earn more, and tend to live longer. And the converse is also true for those in ill health. The health of the population therefore also has implications for government tax revenues, welfare spending, pensions, and other age-related spending. To illustrate the wider economic and fiscal implications of health, we also look at two alternative scenarios for the future evolution of the health of the population. A better health scenario, in which the incidence of work-limiting ill health is 25% lower in 50 years' time than in our central projection, and a worse health scenario, in which the incidence is 25% higher. The long-term fiscal consequences of these alternative health trajectories can be seen in these two charts. They show how the level of the primary fiscal balance in the better and worse health scenarios differs from that in the baseline projection over the next 50 years. As you can see from the chart on the left, the primary deficit is just over 2% of GDP lower in the better health scenario by the mid-2070s. This is due to lower health and welfare spending and higher tax revenues, shown in purple, blue, and yellow. But there's a modest offset from higher pensions and age-related spending, due to people living longer, shown in green. The primary deficit is over 2% higher in the worst health scenario. This is due to higher health and welfare spending and lower tax revenues, and there's a modest offset from lower pension and other age-related spending due to shorter life expectancy and therefore a smaller pensioner population. By the end of the long-term projection, the compounding impact of lower borrowing and consequently lower debt interest spending mean that debt is projected to be 44% of GDP lower in the better health scenario, with the reverse effects pushing debt 49% of GDP higher in the worst health scenario. This suggests that significant changes to the health status of the population can make a material difference to the long-run fiscal outlook, but they are not in themselves enough to put the public finances on a sustainable trajectory. As you can see from the yellow line, even in the better health scenario, debt still doubles as a share of GDP over the next to over 200% by the mid-2070s. And this is because pensions and other age-related spending, whose costs still rise with healthy life expectancy, continue to put upward pressure on debt. That brings me to the final chapter of this report, which provides an updated set of long-term projections for the public finances as a whole. These estimates take as their starting point the latest ONS demographic projections. These show that the total UK population rising from 68% of GDP, 68 million people today, to 82 million people by the mid-2070s. The population is also expected to age considerably over the next 50 years, with, as you can see from this chart, the share of young people falling from 20 to 15%, the share of those of working age between 16 and 64 falling from 61 to 58%, and the share of people over 65 rising from 19 to 27%. The aging of the population matters significantly for the sustainability of the public finances, because most of the government's tax revenues, shown here in light blue, above the x-axis, come from people of working age, whereas most government spending, the various bars below the x-axis, goes on older people. And as you can see from the diamonds on the chart, those between the ages of 20 and 70 tend to make a net positive contribution to the public finances, whereas those under 20 and over 70 tend to be net recipients of public resources. Therefore, over the next 50 years, the aging of the population is projected to drive a growing gap between government spending, shown here in green, which rises to over 60% of GDP, and government revenue, shown here in yellow, which falls to just under 40% of GDP. This results in total government borrowing, the difference between the two, rising to over 20% of GDP by the mid-2070s. The biggest driver of this projected increase in the fiscal deficit are falling revenues from fuel duty and other taxes on emissions, shown in orange, rising spending pressures on health, shown in blue, and rising spending on pensioners, due to both an aging society but also the operation of the triple lock, and the interest costs on the government's growing stock of debt. These growing fiscal deficits feed through into a mounting stock of government debt, which is projected to rise from just under 100% of GDP today to over 270% of GDP in the mid-2070s in our baseline projection, shown here in green. But this doesn't account for the fiscal impact of future economic shocks like the pandemic and the energy crisis, which have been important drivers of recent increases in debt. Taking account of potential future shocks, shown in the green dotted line, debt would rise to over 300% of GDP, higher than it's ever been in this country's history. A better outlook for productivity growth than assumed in our long-term economic projections could help offset some of these fiscal pressures. As you can see from the yellow line on the chart, a return to pre-financial crisis rates of productivity growth could in theory stop debt from rising at all as a share of GDP over the next 50 years. But this would require government to spend none of the fiscal proceeds of this higher growth. If government were instead to raise spending in line with the faster growing economy, then debt would still more than double over the next 50 years. There's clearly a lot of uncertainty about what might happen over the next half century. And so the report looks at a range of alternative scenarios based on different assumptions for things like the cost of climate change, the composition of inward migration, and the rate of productivity growth in both the health service and the wider economy. But under almost any scenario, government's likely to have to raise taxes or cut spending if it's to keep the public finances on a sustainable path in the long term. Keeping debt at around its current level of just under 100% of GDP would require additional policy tightening of around 1 to 1.5% of GDP per decade. Were these fiscal adjustments to come from greater spending restraint, this would require significant improvements in public sector productivity, or strict prioritization between competing pressures. Were the adjustment to come from further increases in taxation, government needs to weigh any additional direct revenue yield against the impact of a rising tax take on incentives to work, invest, and save. Long-term pressures on the public finances could be partly alleviated if we and other countries could find cost-effective ways of limiting the rise in global temperatures, improving the health of our populations, and boosting productivity of our economies. But these would only improve debt sustainability if governments manage to refrain from spending all the resulting fiscal dividends. And with that, I'll hand back to Laura, who will start to take your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. So as Richard said, now it's time for your questions. As a reminder, you can submit these via Slido, either using the QR code shown on screen or via the links on our website or Twitter feed. And we now have all of the Budget Responsibility Committee joining me to answer those questions. We are going to start. I'm going to take a couple of pairs of questions together. The first pair are on the sustainability of our kind of main long-term projection. So I'll probably come to you first on these, David. We've got one from Faisal Islam, who says, do you believe, as your US equivalent, the Congressional Budget Office has said, in the US context, that the UK is on an unsustainable fiscal path? And John Paul Ford Rojas asks, your analysis is based on current policy settings. What are the presumably fairly radical changes to policy that might be needed to make the debt outlook more sustainable? So David, that's a question on the sustainability of the debt outlook and policy action that may be needed in that light, if you would start by taking those.
Sure. I mean, what the report shows is that under the assumption that the government responds to rising pressures on demand by supplying more public sector services, particularly in the health area, but also as a result of the aging population and rising spending on state pensions, but keeps the tax system as it is, so the tax takeout of GDP is more or less constant. There would be, over the longer run, a sustained rise in government spending, not matched by increasing tax revenue. That would drive the stock of debt up in a way that becomes exponential in terms of the growth of debt GDP ratio, as you then have to spend more and more on debt interest. So a strategy of let's just stay where we are and increase government spending in line with demands, that is unsustainable. That's what this report shows. Now, that's not a forecast. It doesn't say that that is inevitably what's going to happen in the UK. There are many ways in which that would turn out to be far too pessimistic, that unsustainable scenario, and Richard mentioned a couple of them. One is, of course, to narrow the gap between tax revenue and expenditure, either by tightening spending down the road and not matching spending to the almost inexorable rise in an aging population in demand for government services. The other is to increase tax rates. It may be that there's a more benign way that this plays out, if it were the case that the productivity rate of growth in the UK would have been more like it was, let's say, between the Second World War and the global financial crisis than it has been in the last 15 years when it's been very much lower. So the message of the report is not that it's inevitable that the UK is on an unsustainable path. It is that with unchanged policies and with growth as mediocre to poor as it's been over the last couple of decades, something's got to give.
And David, could I just ask you to come back on the second question on is there any more you want to say on the changes to policy that might be needed to make the debt outlook more sustainable as far as you can?
In the absence of higher productivity growth, and it may be that there are some government policies that can themselves boost productivity, but in the absence of that, it's inevitable that you have to close that gap between tax revenues as they are with the current tax system, or likely to be with the current tax system, and expenditure if it matches rising demands generated by an aging population. So there would have to be some combination of getting more tax revenue in and changing the provision of public services so it doesn't inexorably rise in line with what is likely to be rising demand from a population that becomes older, less tax rich, and more demanding, particularly in the areas of health and obviously state pensions.
Thank you, David. We're going to move on to a pair of questions that are sort of in and around the topic of health. So I'll come to you first, Richard. Philip Inman at The Guardian asks, did you assess the impact of wellbeing measures detailed in various LSE reports, such as better mental health support, as a way for governments to improve participation and productivity? And Sue Chan asks, given life expectancy improvements have slowed over the past decade, what does that say about the government's ability to raise the state pension age in future? Also, given you've got a ready reckoner for moving from welfare to work, what are the potential fiscal benefits of reversing the post-pandemic inactivity rise? So there's quite a collection of stuff around the same theme there, Richard. I don't know if you want to start by tackling some of those.
Yeah, so because we're the government's official economic and fiscal forecaster, we forecast things that matter for the public finances. Sort of measures of well-being tend to go beyond just things that get picked up by GDP and which generate tax revenues. But it's important to point out that, and I think we highlight in this report, that the kind of interventions that improve well-being, especially around mental health, we try and show in this report can have a decisive impact actually on measured GDP as well as on the public finances over the next 50 years. One of the biggest sources of the increase in ill health in recent years has been mental health problems, I think, and that's also been the single most cited reason for people being outside the workforce. To the extent that you can reverse that trend and make a difference over the next 50 years in a way that makes people, it not only improves their mental health, but also makes them more likely to stay in the workforce, that has a number of fiscal dividends. If they're working, they're paying tax, they're less likely to be on welfare benefits, they're also less likely to fall ill and need support from the health service. And so in the projections that we produced this time around and in the scenarios that we explored, we tried to look at what are the benefits of actually improving people's health, be it physical health or be it mental health, be it whatever other barriers to people playing a full part in the workforce. If you can address those, they make quite a big difference over the medium term. We showed overall that improving the population's health can reduce borrowing in 50 years by about 2% of GDP. About half of that is coming, from the higher tax revenues you get from keeping them in work and lower welfare costs that you would incur were they to be out of work. So there is a number of benefits that you get economically as well as to the public finances from improving people's mental health, on top of course, the benefits that would have for the well-being of the individuals. In terms of what we assume in the forecasts about the state pension age, we assume it goes up in line with announced government policy. So that is reflected in our forecasts. I think there is within that a government commitment to adjust the state pension age to keep the proportion of people's lives spent in retirement more or less constant over time. So to the extent that feeds back into future decisions about the state pension age, there may be some automatic adjustment there. If people are living longer, the state pension age goes up. If people have shorter lives or life expectancy starts to fall, that might mean that future rises in the state pension age happen later. For the moment, we take the current ONS projections for longevity and stated government policy on future increases in the state pension age.
Thanks, Richard. And on the bonus second part of Sue's question, I can, which was what would be the potential fiscal benefits of reversing the post-pandemic inactivity rise? Sue, I can refer you back to last year's Fiscal Risks and Sustainability Report, which answered exactly that question. I think off the top of my head, it was around 20 billion or close to 1% of GDP lower borrowing at the end of our 5-year medium-term forecast horizon. So the work we've done on health and inactivity this year builds on that work last year, but I think it's last year's report that directly answered that bit of your question. We're going to a question on our climate work now, which is your report suggests the direct costs of climate damage are really rather small. Doesn't this mean that we in the UK don't need to worry very much about damage from climate change? Tom, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So, I mean, basically, I would say, no, I would not draw that conclusion. I think essentially, if you look at the full extent of the fiscal costs from climate change, both in this report and in previous analysis that we have done, it is sizable. And as we say in the report, there is also quite a significant downside risk to the baseline projections that we set out in this report. So the analysis does find that the direct costs to the government in the UK of dealing with extreme weather events as they occur, such as the cost of repairs to infrastructure or compensation to household, is relatively low in the UK. That's based on analysis we've done on the cost of those sort of incidents happening in the past, and they're consistent with other research findings in this area by other institutions. And there is some evidence that the UK is less exposed to those sort of weather events than other countries. But nonetheless, when you combine those costs with the indirect costs to the economy from lower productivity due to climate change over the long run, it together leads to a sizable increase in government debt of around 25 to 35% of GDP. And then, as I say, I think we explain in the report why the risks to those baseline projections are skewed probably to the downside. We look at scenarios where the impact on GDP is potentially greater, and that leads to an increase in debt of around 65% of GDP over the long term. And we think there are plausible reasons why risks are skewed to the downside. So one reason is that we base the projections on scenarios where the increase in global temperatures due to climate change is limited to 2 or 3 degrees, on the basis that global effort to tackle climate change either continue or accelerate. And if global efforts were to stall or backtrack, then the risks of higher costs would be considerable. And we also, in this report, do not model the potential impact of kind of more severe global climate events, or the risk of other countries that might be more exposed to climate change experiencing greater economic costs, which are then transmitted to the UK. So both of those things mean the risks around our baseline projections are probably skewed to the downside. And then finally, the costs in this report should also be seen as kind of additional to the costs of to the government of transitioning to net zero, which we looked at in a 2021 report, and were of a similar scale, around 20% of GDP. So overall, I think if you look at the potential costs of the UK from all of the different aspects of climate change, they are sizable, and there's quite a considerable amount of downside risk around them.
Thanks very much, Tom. We've got a couple of questions in relation to migration and our migration scenarios. David, I'll come to you first on these, if that's okay. So we've got one from Tim Wallace, who says, have you got a rule of thumb for how much migration affects the finances? For instance, what do the debt figures look like if the net zero migration projection came to pass? And Phil Aldrich asks, what would happen in a lower migration scenario? Migrants help the dependency ratio in the short term, but as the report points out, they then age themselves. So how different would the long-term fiscal picture be? So I think those are really sort of two questions on very much the same theme, David, if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, the impact of net migration is pretty sensitive. I mean, not only to the numbers of migrants, but actually probably even more so to some characteristics of the migrants. In particular, are the migrants earning about average wages in the UK or above that or beneath that? And we have a scenario which shows how things might evolve just in terms of the purely fiscal effects of migrants earning materially more on average than the what you might call the current resident population, and substantially less. And there's a chart, it's chart 4.17, page 113, that shows, perhaps not surprisingly, that makes a pretty material difference. So if migrants on average were earning 50% lower than average earnings of people in the UK right now, then the stock of debt, instead of going to 275% of GDP, holding everything else constant, that's more like 350% of GDP. But on the flip side, if migrants on average are earning 30% more than the population that's here right now, then the stock of debt will rise, I say only to 225% or so of GDP, but that's 50% of GDP less than on the central projection. So that characteristic of migrants, perhaps not surprisingly, matters a great deal. It also matters how long migrants stay, and we do a projection where half the migrants stay pretty much for the rest of their lives, and half the migrants might stay for just a few years. And again, purely fiscally, then there's an advantage in people staying in the UK while they're working, generating tax revenue, perhaps not drawing so much on the health service. That's beneficial fiscally, and that makes a bit of a difference as well. I mean, in terms of the overall numbers, I think in the short run, given that migrants, when they come to the UK, tend to be relatively young and of working age, and pay taxes and don't draw upon public services very much, particularly in their first few years, then the short run effect of simply there being more people, more migrants, is narrowly fiscally measured beneficial. But that, of course, is a short run effect. The longer run effect is different because the migrants age, they may have kids, they will draw upon public services, particularly health services, as they get older. And so the short run benefit is almost certainly larger in terms of the fiscal impact than the long run benefit. But I think it's the characteristics of migrants in terms of their earnings and how long they stay are as important, if not more important, than the absolute numbers.
Thank you, David. A question, I might come to Tom on this first. Another question from Faisal Islam. Would a change in the debt measure used by the Treasury to use the measure excluding Bank of England losses have a material impact on your assessment of medium-term fiscal sustainability, i.e. meeting the debt rule? So I think Faisal might be moving on from the precise topic of today's report and looking ahead to next month, but perhaps you could say a little bit on that, Tom.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I mean, this report is focused on the long run, and we will obviously be looking at the medium term in a lot of detail at the next budget on the 30th of October. I mean, I think what I would say is that when you are looking at the long run sustainability, as David says, what is really driving the unsustainable path in the future that we show in this report is the fact that government responding to pressures from demand for public services, pushing up spending as a share of GDP, while our projections suggest that revenues from tax stay largely constant. In fact, they fall a little bit because we assume the government loses revenue from for example, fuel duty over the next 20 years. And, those pressures will be there regardless of the precise measure that is used to assess government debt.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I think that's a good advert for the briefing we'll be doing next month on the medium-term position alongside the budget for a bit more on that particular topic. A couple of questions I'll take together on broadly on kind of things that might help alleviate the kind of central picture we present in our projections. I might ask Richard to come in first on these, and then David, if he's got anything to add. So Tom Railton asks, do you believe that higher public investment could contribute to fiscal sustainability and mitigate some of these risks, for example, on climate, health and productivity? And Tom Rees asks, the debt increase can be largely offset by productivity growth returning to pre-financial crisis levels. Do you see any reasons why this might be the case, such as AI, or is that still very unlikely? So is public investment the answer, or is productivity the answer? Richard first.
Thanks, Laura, and David should definitely come in as well. On the question of can public investment make a difference to long-run growth and fiscal sustainability, boy, have we got the paper for you, Tom. It came out just a few weeks ago, and it looks at the way in which we think about the impact of public investment on the potential output of the UK economy. And David can say a bit more about its findings in a minute. But the short answer is that it can make something of a difference, but the lags are long, and so it can take some time for it to make a material difference to the potential output of the economy, and it depends on a number of assumptions that you make along the way. In terms of productivity,
attention, please.
Oh dear.
it sounds as though we may be in the middle of a fire alarm, which was...
Well, it's stopped for now, so
Right.
I can't see any smoke or flame. So why don't you crack on, Richard?
In which case, I should carry on. I think one of the things that could significantly help the outlook for the public finances would be a return to something like pre-financial crisis rates of productivity growth. I think I'd say the balance of risks around that looking forward, I think, are in both directions. There are some reasons for optimism, like around artificial intelligence, and especially for an economy like the UK, which is heavily service oriented, which has a significant IT sector, and other kinds of sectors like pharmaceuticals, where AI might make a big difference to the pace of innovation. There are some reasons to be optimistic, but I think we are also a very open economy. We depend on our ability to trade with the rest of the world, and all the numbers on international trends in international trade are going in the wrong direction, which is that our ability to access international markets depends on people keeping their markets open, and there are more and more both protectionist pressures coming to the fore in various countries, as well as just what looks like in the data a general slowdown in the growth of global trade as a share of global activity. And because trade provides an opportunity to realize things like economies of scale and comparative advantage, the less trade is growing, oftentimes that means the less productivity is happening in the global economy because you're not realizing those opportunities. So I think there are risks on both sides. We illustrate both an upside productivity scenario, but also a downside productivity scenario to illustrate that. And it does make the single biggest difference to the sustainability picture, with the crucial caveat that governments have to not spend the upside if they end up getting higher growth. They can't just adjust government spending in line with the larger economy, because that obviously just obviates what might be the net fiscal benefit to the bottom line that you get from higher tax revenues. And David, you might want to come in
let me just pick up your point very briefly on productivity. I mean, it really is transformational if productivity growth looks a bit more like the 1960 to 2010 average than the dismal last 15 years or so. Last 15 years, productivity growth has been barely 0.5%. 1960 to 2010, over that 50 years, it was a bit north of 2%. If we got back to the slightly above 2%, 2.5%, and the government uses the extra revenue that generates to pay down debt, then instead of the stock of debt being 275% of GDP, it's well under 100%. It'd be south of where we are today, maybe 65% or so. Now, how plausible is that? I think the issue with productivity is, for very good reasons, it is inherently unforecastable. I mean, over the long run, productivity growth tends to be generated by discovering new things. Well, if you knew the things that were going to be discovered in the future, you'd already have discovered them. So they're almost, by definition, the main technological drivers of productivity growth are unforecastable. We take a kind of, in our base case scenario, a halfway house between the miserable last 15 years, roughly 0.5% a year productivity growth. The 50 years before that, more like 2.5. Take the average of those two, you get to 1.5%. And that's what we assume in the central scenario. Some people call it optimistic because it's higher than the last 50 years. If you took it in the context of the last 60 or 70 years, it looks pessimistic. Who knows whether the next 50 years will be at the higher end of that spectrum or the lower end of that spectrum, but for sure it makes a very big difference. Now, there may be things that the government can do about that. Of course, that's not easy. Governments have been saying for all of my life that they have policies to boost growth of the UK. I mean, Harold Wilson, when 60 years ago in the early 1960s, talking about the white hot heat of technology and all that. And it's proved pretty difficult perhaps to move the dial. But the dial does change. Again, maybe not largely as a result of government policy, but just a result of people discovering stuff. And it makes a huge difference to the outlook, to the economy. In terms of, very briefly, in terms of government spending and infrastructure, the paper that we put out in August on our framework for analysing that made some estimates of average rates of return on public sector investment. One of the big differences, of course, and it depends very much on what is the nature of public sector investment spending, is the time horizon in which they pay off and generate growth in the potential output of the economy, GDP and tax revenue. And some types of infrastructure investment might take 20 or 25 years. It takes a long time to build nuclear power stations, to build a new railway line, even to build a new motorway. Other kinds of investment can pay off in 24 hours. If you fix a load of potholes in the morning, people can drive over them the next morning. You've got a payoff that starts 24 hours after you do the investment. So it depends in terms of time horizons very much what is the nature of the public sector investment. And that's something that we at the OBR then need to consider in the light of any plans government have to boost infrastructure spending. What kind of spending is it?
Thanks, David. I enjoyed that answer, both for the Harold Wilson quotation and the assertion from the person responsible for forecasting productivity for us that it's unforecastable. Very good. I think we're going to have to come straight back to you, David. We've got a question from David Milliken, who says, what do these debt projections mean for living standards over the long term? Do they imply that it will be a struggle for household disposable income to rise significantly, even if GDP per capita picks up, as more needs to be spent on health, environment, security, etc.?
The projections, which show, in a sense, unchanged tax system, would mean that the burden of paying for sort of rising public sector provision of services, state pensions, but particularly health, is in fact not paid by households in the form of higher taxes. And that's precisely what causes the stock of debt to rise so much. So on that central projection, it's not so much that shows that households have less and less income to spend and their standards of living decline. It's more that what it shows is that if governments continue to provide public services in line with rising demand, don't pay for it in taxes, how much debt do they have to issue? Now, the problem with that is, of course, that it's almost certainly unsustainable. At some point, it will blow up. You can't just expect the rest of the world to keep on buying more and more UK government debt, which rises at an ever-accelerating rate. So the problem with our central projection is it's almost certainly one that would be infeasible, and at some point, the system would blow up because people wouldn't be willing to buy the debt. And that really is the central fiscal issue, which requires some combination of the most benign outcome, which is that growth productivity can rise faster than it has over the last 15 years or so, or what you might call the less benign outcomes, where to close that gap, you need some combination of providing fewer services and government expenditure not rising as much as on our projections, and the tax take out of GDP rising to help close the gap. One of the issues then about standards of living is if you increase the tax take out of GDP, and that's the main way of trying to close the gap, on the central projection, government spending as a percentage of GDP goes from roughly, the low 40% to 60%. Now, if you try and close that gap almost exclusively through increasing the tax revenue, the tax take's got to go from where it is today, about 40% of GDP, to 60%. Can you do that in a way that doesn't damage people's incentives to work and to save on such a scale that it actually undermines the production of the GDP which the tax revenues depend on? And that's a really difficult question to answer. But one would, I think, be wary of thinking that you can increase the tax take, and that's the main way of closing that gap year after year, without it doing some serious damage to the productive potential of the economy and the growth in productivity, which is the more painless way of closing the gap.
Thank you very much, David. We've got 12 minutes left and a few questions still to get to, so we'll keep going. We'll pick up the pace. Do submit any final questions via Slido now if you still want to get one in, and we'll attempt to get through all of them. Quick specific question, maybe Tom, you can answer this. Do these projections for spending exclude the cost of the reforms of the now scrapped Deal-Not style cap on social care, or did the government decision come too late for this to be included?
Thanks. So the projections in the report are all based on policy as it was at the time of the March budget. And therefore policy announcements after that are not incorporated into the report. I mean, we do look at the impact of our demographic projections on social care alongside wider health system. And like the wider health system, because of the same demographic trends, we do project an increase in the cost of social care over the projection period. I think it's roughly rising from about 1.5% of GDP to about 2.5% of GDP. We will obviously revisit that in the future on the basis of new government policy.
Thanks, Tom. Richard, I'll come to you on this one. John Paul Ford Rojas asks, the government today blamed the problems highlighted in the report on the shocking state that our public finances were left in with the previous government. Is that right? Or is the path for debt actually created by external factors and demographics and policy choices faced by governments of all stripes?
So the projections reflect demographic trends over the next 50 years. And so the fiscal position of the government at any point in time makes less of a difference compared to those enormous pressures on the public finances that emerge over a 50-year period from things like an aging society, from rising interest costs. And those are challenges that have faced successive governments over extended periods. And I should say also that they're not challenges that are unique to the UK. Our sister organizations, like in the US, the Congressional Budget Office, produce similar projections for the US, showing their own welfare state also unsustainable in the long run, given that they have also had a baby boom which has entered retirement and then ages over the next few decades and puts upward pressure in the US on things like Social Security and Medicare. So these challenges are not unique to the UK. They're not unique to this particular point in time. They're challenges facing all advanced countries whose societies are aging, and they have welfare systems designed for a time when more people were in work than were in retirement.
Thanks, Richard. We'll keep working through, plenty of questions to get through. Henry Saker Clark, the Press Association, asks, given last year's report suggested that public debt could rise to more than 300% of GDP, what has pulled down the long-term projection in this report? And are these factors likely to bring down future projections further? David, are you able to have a first go at that one?
I'll have a go. One of the big changes between now and a year ago is that the Office for National Statistics projections of what happens to the population in the UK have changed really rather a lot. Not so much because there's a reassessment of the fertility rate and the number of kids that are being born to people in the UK, to women, but that the scale of net migration on their central forecast is very substantially higher. And in the shorter term, that's really quite fiscally likely to be beneficial. And we talked a little bit earlier about how the average age of migrants when they come to the UK is relatively young. It's probably in the mid to late 20s. Those people are generating tax revenue because most of them work, and it isn't until quite a long way down the road that they really begin to draw on, particularly the health service, and may be eligible for the state pension. So one factor which accounts, probably the biggest single one, for the difference between our projection last year and this year is the very large change in the Office for National Statistics assumption about what happens to the scale of net migration. Because that's pretty uncertain, and it will depend very much on policies of future governments in terms of visas and requirements for people to get into the UK. And the fiscal effects, as I mentioned earlier, depend as much upon the characteristics of the migrants as they do upon simply the number. What are the average earnings? How long do people stay? So I think that is probably the single biggest factor for the difference.
Thank you very much. An admirably concise question from Sue Chan. Is the triple lock sustainable? Tom, do you want to have a go at that?
Thanks. Well, I mean, I think as David has said, the alongside health, it's pensions which creates the sort of biggest additional pressure on the public finances over the long run, and that is certainly driven by both the demographic pressures, but also by the impact of the triple lock, which is a considerable factor in terms of increasing the cost of the state pension over this period. I think one finding in the report that I think is really interesting is when we looked at the better health scenarios that Richard talked about in the health spending chapter, there are some potential fiscal benefits from better health that Richard talked through. But if better health also leads people to live longer lives, which is obviously a great thing, but it does also increase the cost of pension provision, and that potentially could offset quite a lot of the fiscal benefits of better health, depending on the sort of assumptions you make about how much that better health does lead to higher life expectancy. I think that really, for me, underlined the importance of looking at the sustainability of the state pension system over the long term, alongside the kind of pressures on health that we look at in the report.
Thank you, Tom. We're circling back to public investment, so I'll come to you, David. Tom Railton says, given your points on the lag effects on public investment, is it a problem that the current fiscal rules are limited to assessing the impact of spending over a 5-year period? Does this create bad incentives around long-term investment?
It's certainly helpful, I think, when thinking about the fiscal position, to do exactly what we do in this report, which is take a long horizon, and that it does allow for the fact that many kinds of infrastructure investment may not have most of their payoff for 5, 10, 15 years or more. But governments also have to sell the debt that could be one of the main sources of financing a big increase in infrastructure spending. And there's an issue there about persuading the potential buyers of gilts that what might look like a very big increase in the sale of government debt in the UK is okay because 20 years from now all this stuff will pay off. So I think that there's a reason why governments pretty consistently over recent decades, when they've had fiscal rules, pretty consistently have been concerned about what happens to the stock of debt relative to GDP in the relatively near term. And that's because I think you're always beholden on the buyers of gilts. And the OBR could perfectly legitimately take a relatively optimistic view of the return on some public sector investment and note that in 15, 20, 25 years' time, it will boost potential output. But you do have to persuade the buyers of gilts today that they want to hold an increased flow. And when the stock of debt is already 100% of GDP, and some of the sources of demand for gilts are likely to be lower in the future, the Bank of England is now a seller rather than a buyer. Defined benefit pension schemes, historically big buyers of gilts, probably are running down their balance sheets over the next 10, 15 years because most DB pension schemes are closed. Governments, are and should be very aware of how many gilts they really have to sell year by year. And the answer is that those are quite big numbers.
Thanks, David. We've got a few minutes left and a few more questions. So we're going to see if we can get through 2 or 3 more of them, and then we'll sadly have to wrap it up. Richard, I'll come to you on a question on defence spending. Mireen Khan says, could you talk a little bit more about defence spending? You take 2.5% of GDP for future decades. Under what scenarios will the level of defence spending have to rise beyond this? And are there any growth or economic benefits from increased defence spending?
Just very quickly, we don't assume defence spending rises to 2.5% GDP because that was an ambition of the government rather than a stated policy commitment reflected in our March forecast. So we're assuming that defence stays around its current level of around 2% of GDP around the NATO commitment. So to the extent, meeting the previous government's ambitions and indeed the current government's ambitions to raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP would be an upward pressure on these projections compared to what you see now.
I recommend our report from, I think, 2 years ago, which had lots more on that, including some scenarios around higher spending. Let's go to A. Robinson. I will take a couple of questions for you, actually, David. A. Robinson asks, how crucial is it for the government to address declining birth rates through policy when considering fiscal sustainability? And there's also a specific question from Neil McDonald at Channel 4 News. Under your central scenario, what share of government spending will go to paying interest on the national debt in 50 years' time? So a question on birth rates and a question on debt interest.
On the debt interest one, on our central projections, the government will be spending something north of 12%, about 12.5% of GDP will go on debt interest 50 years from now. That's on the central trajectory, which is that the stock of debt rises very greatly. I mean, today, government spending on debt interest is about 4.5% or so of GDP. So that would go up, that would more or less triple to 12.5% of GDP on the central projection, assuming that the government can sell that debt at about the same interest rates as today, which itself is actually quite optimistic, because if you had that much more debt to sell, the idea that you could find buyers at the same interest rate, even though the stock of debt was 3%, 3 times GDP, is a bit optimistic. So what was the other bit of the question?
Birth rates, David.
Oh yeah, birth rates.
Should the government be addressing that through policy when considering fiscal sustainability?
I rather doubt whether there are many things that governments can do to change the fertility rate, short of spending huge amounts of money and trying to subsidize people to have sort of 3 kids or more. And the fertility rate is a reflection of choices made by people, primarily made by women. And the idea that you can benefit the fiscal position by having the population rise year after year, I think is probably somewhat misguided anyway. And it seems to me that there are plausibly other adjustment mechanisms for what might be a flat or declining population in some countries, besides trying to encourage women to have more children than they actually seem to want at the moment. So, for example, we've seen changes in the state pension age already. That probably has got further still to play out, as life expectancy is much higher now than it was when people decided that 65 was the age at which people could get pensions. And I think there's also, very briefly, a natural economic mechanism which adjusts for the changing demographics. And it's this: people worry that with relatively low fertility rates, there'll be a shortage of workers. Who's going to do all the work? Who's going to look after the young and the old? And I think part of the answer for that is the old themselves, in the sense that if there is a shortage of labour, there'll be natural adjustments in terms of wages, and also making work more attractive and feasible for people who at the moment we might think of as retirement age, 62, 63, 65, by adjusting the work environment so that people can work more flexibly, maybe work part-time. And that's a natural adjustment in a world in which there may be fewer people of what we used to think of as standard working age, 20 to 60. I think those adjustments, which over the long run I think will be very powerful, are probably more likely to be the answer to low fertility than trying to encourage women to have lots more children.
Thank you. It's past midday, so we are going to have to draw things to a close there. I can see there's a few questions we didn't get to. Apologies for that. We're very happy to follow up afterwards if you want to explore answers to those questions or require any further information. So do get in touch with us. The very good news is that you don't have to wait too long at all to hear from us again. Our next press briefing will be on the 30th of October, following the publication of our next economic and fiscal outlook alongside the autumn budget. And we look forward to seeing many of you then.